The Game Boy modding scene has some pretty wacky mods, and when it comes to the more unique builds out there, a modder by the name of RetroHai has some of the craziest. One in particular is unique in that it looks like a DMG, but it natively plays Game Boy Advance games by way of putting a Nintendo DS motherboard inside the shell. This is called the DMG-103, and it is quite difficult and a bit messy to pull off. That is until now. A modder by the name of Nintendre has created a kit that makes this mod easier and way cleaner to do. He calls it the EZDMG-103. So let's dive in and check it out. Hey everyone, how's it going? My name is Tito and welcome to another episode of Retro Renew. To kickstart the new year, we'll be taking a look at a very interesting kit that puts a Nintendo DS Lite motherboard into a DMG shell, giving us one of the most unique Game Boy builds out there. This is called the DMG-103, but the kit we're using to build it is called the EZDMG-103 kit. And well, that's because it's supposed to make the mod easier to do. What this kit does is it uses an assortment of custom ribbon cables and circuit boards to make the DMG-103 mod easier to do and result in a much cleaner build, which of course I'm a huge fan of. You see, typically the DMG-103s are custom one-off builds, and they're made by soldering literally hundreds of strands of magnet wire, hacking up a shell, and using not a small amount of hot glue. This leaves you with not only a challenging mod, but also a bit of a mess. And that's where the EZDMG-103 kit comes into play. The creator of this mod is Andre, a very talented modder out of Austria who created this kit to make the whole DMG-103 modding experience just way better, and I have a feeling he really did pull it off. Now, taking a look at all the parts needed for this build, we see it's still quite a few components, but we're going to focus on some of the more unique items specific to Andre's kit. First up are these ribbon cables. These will tap both the button input signals from the motherboard as well as the cartridge pins for both the DS and Game Boy Advance cart readers. These alone save you the hassle of soldering tons of individual wires. Also included are these regular ribbon cables that connect all the various internal components together. Next, we have this custom button PCB, which adapts the DS motherboard to the DMG form factor, and actually will be holding the audio amp to give us loud and crisp audio. And this other custom board does a lot. It houses the USB-C charging circuitry, as well as both the DS and GBA cartridge connectors. It actually does a bunch more, as we'll see during the build portion of the video. Additionally, we have these smaller boards that are for the rear-mounted triggers, which actually utilize Xbox 360 triggers, which we will need to source for this project. Andre also made this custom glass screen lens that will accommodate the lower DS screen, which we will be reusing for this project. And of course, you will need to source a donor DS Lite so that we can harvest the motherboard and some of the other various components. I recommend you get one that is in total disrepair, like this pink one here that has a broken top screen and a broken hinge mechanism. Now, there will be some other off-the-shelf items that you will need to source yourself, like the audio amp that I was speaking about earlier, as well as a few other items. These are all listed on Andre's GitHub, and we will touch on each of these components during the build tutorial portion of the video. Now, the last item I want to talk about that makes this build a whole lot easier is the custom rear shell design. On Legacy 103 builds, you would need to do a significant amount of trimming to the rear shell, but these custom ones take care of all that and have all the accommodations and features needed to make the EZDMG-103. These models will be available for you to download and print on your own if you have a 3D printer, or you can send these to a 3D printing service like PCBWay, which just so happens to be the sponsor of today's video. If you have an idea for a new mod or want to assemble an open source project, PCBWay provides you with the tools to make them a reality. From 3D printing services in an array of materials, all the way to other services like CNC machining, injection molding, and of course PCB and flex ribbon fabrication. So when it comes to taking your retro mods to the next level, PCBWay is the place to make that happen. Check out the link in the description for PCBWay to get $5 off your first order, and again, a huge thank you to PCBWay for sponsoring this video. Alright, with that out of the way, let's put this DMG-103 all together. Alright, so to start things off, we obviously need to harvest the motherboard from the DS Lite, and like I previously stated, you definitely want to use a damaged console for mods like this, even though this kit actually is completely reversible. So let's tear this thing apart and pull out that motherboard. Okay, with the motherboard completely bare, we can get a sense of all the parts we need to remove. The charging port, volume slider, the GBA and DS card reader, and the battery contacts. But we're actually going to remove the battery contacts a bit later since we do need to be able to test the motherboard as we mod it. So starting with the volume slider, I'll add some fresh solder to the pads and then very carefully try to lift each side with my tweezers while heating both pads on each side. I'll do this on both sides until it eventually comes off. Next is the charge port. Again, I'll add some fresh solder to the pins, but since this is a through-hole component, I can use my desoldering gun to remove it. Now comes the more difficult part, which is removing the cartridge connectors. Starting with the Game Boy Advance one, I'll again add some fresh solder, and then remove as much as I can with some solder wick. I then actually attempted to slightly lift the mounting pad, but the whole thing came off, which is fine since we aren't actually reusing this cart connector. We'll be using a new one. I then did the same thing on the other side. Now, in order to desolder the side of the cartridge with all the pins, I'm going to be using some Chip Quick, which is essentially low melt solder. This will basically allow me to keep all the solder on these pins liquid for a longer amount of time, allowing me to remove the entire connector. I basically work the low melt solder into all of the pins and then run my iron over top until I can lift the connector off. Hot air would be another option that you could use to remove this component. And once it's off, I'll clean off all the residual solder to get some nice and clean pads. Now, as a warning, there are some very small components in this area of the board, so you'll want to make sure to avoid touching them with the low melt solder or accidentally bridging them together. Next, we'll remove the DS cartridge reader using a method very similar to the one we just used on the Game Boy Advance cartridge reader. And again, once it's off, we'll clean all the pads. Fantastic, we now have a bare DS motherboard that's ready to be modded. The next thing that we need to do is populate this ribbon cable with the included ZIF connectors. It would have been nice if these were already populated on the ribbon, but I imagine this was done to save on costs and keep the kit as affordable as possible. The only other thing that we need to do is solder in a 330 ohm resistor, which is needed to trick the DS into thinking it still has the top screen. This is the exact same method that we use on a DS macro mod. And this is how the ribbon should look once completed. Now we can start to solder in the two ribbon cables to the motherboard, starting with the one for the cart reader pads. We'll first take our time and align it with the GBA cartridge pads, and then solder it in place. Once that's done, we'll solder in the contacts for the volume slider. And the last thing we'll solder in are the contacts for the DS cartridge reader by folding the ribbon cable over as shown. Do note that when aligning the ribbon cable over the pads, this pin here all the way on the right will not be soldered in. This pad is left out on purpose, so make sure the ribbon is aligned properly, taking this into consideration. Alright, one ribbon down, one to go. Now for the button ribbon, we can see that there are quite a few test pads that we need to solder to on the motherboard, which are highlighted on the ribbon itself. So what I like to do is pre-tin all the test point pads on the motherboard first. Then I'll place the ribbon on the motherboard, and all the solder points should align with the ribbon cable itself. And from here, it's just a matter of soldering in each point. Make sure you don't forget any, since there are quite a few and they're pretty small, so they could be easy to miss. And here's how the DS motherboard should look with both ribbons fully installed. Next, we're going to start populating the cartridge carrier board, starting by installing the DS cart reader. Both the DS and GBA cart readers have guide pegs, which really do help align the readers perfectly when soldering them in. Next, we'll do the same for the GBA cart reader. Now we're going to go ahead and install the momentary switch, which will be used to power the console on and off, followed by the volume wheel. Here you can see that I'm soldering in the charge indicator LED. I bent the legs as shown so that it's in the upright position. Also make sure that the polarity is correct when installing. The shorter legs on these LEDs are ground. And once everything is installed, just put it into the rear shell to make sure that all the buttons and dials work properly. Next, we need to do a bit of trimming to the front shell, more specifically the LCD bezel. What I did here is use the screen lens as a gauge of what I need to trim, and then used a marker and ruler to mark those areas off. I then scored the plastic with a craft knife, and used some needle nose pliers to fatigue the plastic off the scored edge. Then, after cleaning up the edges, I checked my work by placing the new screen lens onto the shell to make sure I got all the areas out of the way of the bezel. Once satisfied, we'll need to start working on the screen aligning bracket. For this, we'll need to install some brass inserts. I actually never did this before, but got pretty good results by using my soldering iron to insert them into the plastic, making sure to not go all the way down. And then, while the plastic is still melted, using the back end of my metal tweezers to ensure they are sitting flush with the plastic surface. This method worked absolutely flawlessly and made quick work of these inserts. With the bracket finished, I went ahead and mixed up some 2-part epoxy so that we can affix the bracket to the inside of the front shell. When installing it, make sure it is fully seated against the shell and that it's making good contact. Anyway, now I'm going to start prepping the button board by installing the audio amp. I went ahead and soldered the 7 header pins to the amp itself, which will allow me to set it onto the board and solder it in there. Make sure you are soldering in the amp onto the front side of the button board. Then to finish the button board off, we're going to go ahead and solder in the 3.5mm headphone jack. And this is what the completed button board should look like. Now here, I pre-assembled the trigger PCBs. After soldering in the momentary switch, you'll need to use one of the included long screws and secure it with 2 brass inserts. We're actually using these inserts because they're just narrow enough to fit the spring around it. This will become clear once we install the triggers themselves. So to install the triggers, you need to insert the metal dowel into the trigger as shown, and then set it into the rear shell. Then drop in the spring, followed by the trigger PCB, ensuring that the stacked brass inserts are set into the spring itself. Then secure the PCB using 4 screws. With both triggers installed, give them a quick test to ensure they're working properly. Alright, now before we remove the battery terminal on the motherboard, let's test it out to make sure it still boots. And it looks like it's successfully booted, which means we're good to proceed. So to remove the battery contacts, I added some low melt solder to each of the pads and used some hot air to pull it off. And in its place, I soldered in the battery JST connector to the positive and negative terminals. Now the battery contacts that we just removed will be press fitted into the rear shell as shown here. And then we'll solder in the other JST connector to the corresponding positive and negative pads as shown here. Definitely make sure you do not mix up the polarity on either of these connectors. And one thing I forgot to do earlier in the video is solder in this indicator LED, which again is to indicate when the console is turned off or when it has low battery. Then we can secure the cartridge carrier board into the rear shell, which includes this 3D printed spacer with a brass insert already installed. Now with the carrier board installed, we can go ahead and solder in the 4 wires which connect the trigger PCBs to the board itself. After doing that, I went ahead and dropped in the battery and then installed the battery cover. Next, we can start connecting the various ribbon cables. The motherboard goes in next and is installed sideways and is secured with 2 screws. Be sure to use washers when securing the motherboard to help spread the load over a larger area. You also want to be sure not to over tighten these screws, as they will cause the board to bend and potentially crack, so definitely be very careful here. And this is actually how the motherboard sits in the shell. It is at a bit of an angle, and that's perfectly normal. Now we can start to connect the other various ribbon cables. But before we proceed, we need to solder these wires here, which connect the USB-C port on the carrier board to the charging circuitry on the DS motherboard. And before installing the lower DS LCD, we do need to remove the touch panel. Then we can drop it into the bracket that we previously glued in. And behind that, we can drop in and secure the LCD with the 3D printed retaining bracket. Next, we'll drop in the speaker along with its own 3D printed retaining bracket, followed by the buttons and membranes. Then to secure it all in place, we'll drop in the custom button board and secure it with a few screws. And the last thing we're going to be soldering in are the speaker wires to the button board. And before putting the 2 halves together, we'll be connecting the button board and LCD to the motherboard using the 2 ribbon cables, which should end up looking a little something like this. Then connect the battery and fold the 2 halves together. And lastly, install the custom glass screen lens to finish it off. And there you have it, the EZDMG-103 all put together. So while I can see how this kit does make the DMG-103 building process significantly easier, I do have to say it is still quite the challenge. This mod is most certainly reserved for skilled modders, so don't let the easy name fool you. But other than that, I have to say that the results are quite stunning, and Andre really did make this a much cleaner and far more professional looking build than what previously constituted a DMG-103 build. Looking through the clear rear shell, we can see that there isn't a rat's nest of wires, but rather a very cohesive and professional end result. Anyway, let's discuss the features that the EZDMG-103 brings to the table. Now, probably the biggest thing when it comes to a build like this is the ability to play GBA games in a DMG form factor. This is pretty neat, and I can see huge fans of the DMG really going for a build like this, especially since it uses original Nintendo hardware and is not relying on emulation. And speaking of which, thanks to the DS hardware, it is capable of running a limited number of emulators with consoles up to the Sega Genesis or Super Nintendo, since the 103 does keep the DS cartridge slot, allowing you to use a R4 card or one of these Easy Flash parallel carts. Anyway, now let's take a look around the console itself. Starting around top, we have the USB-C port for charging the handheld's battery. When plugged in, the charge indicator LED illuminates amber, and it's actually a very nice dim amber and not aggressively bright, which is a very nice touch. I wish more mods actually used these dimmer LEDs, to be honest. And right next to that is the DS cartridge slot, which allows you to effortlessly insert DS carts. It does require some trimming of the front shell to work, but overall I'm glad that it's included since this is technically an optional thing to do. And right behind that we have the GBA cart. Do keep in mind that this does not work with regular Game Boy or Game Boy Color games, but of course allows you to natively play Game Boy Advance games. Thanks to the custom rear shell, the cart slots nicely into place. Here on the right side, we have the power button as well as the volume dial. Sound is crisp and clear, mixing both the right and left audio channels while piping it through to the single speaker around front, all thanks to that audio amp that we installed on the button board. And on the bottom, we have the perfectly placed headphone jack. When headphones are plugged in, this does automatically shut off the audio going to the speaker as one would expect. It works flawlessly. And on the left side of the console, we do have an unpopulated opening where the contrast wheel would normally be on a DMG, and right above that is the power indicator LED, which occupies the old DC power jack. This is a dual color LED that turns green when the console is on, and red when the battery is low. Anyway, around back, the most obvious features are the triggers, which stick out considerably. But to be perfectly honest, they are extremely comfortable to use and are placed in just the right spot. And they also act as a pretty neat stand for the DMG-103. Now, since we are missing the top screen of the DS, very much like a macro build, the vast majority of DS games are unplayable, but there are a few that do mostly utilize the bottom screen that could be played. However, you'll notice that on my particular build of the 103, it only has two action buttons, A and B. It's missing X and Y. Now, it should be noted that the button board does have contacts for both the X and Y buttons, so this is something I can add later, which will be helpful for playing those rare DS games that are compatible with one screen, or even some of the DS supported emulators. Like I previously mentioned, you can utilize an R4 or a flash cart like it to play a limited number of emulators. Here you can see that I have a few like Game Boy and Sega Genesis. However, while these do work, I couldn't figure out how to get the games to display on the bottom screen, which is a bit unfortunate. If you know how to get these emulators to display on the bottom screen, definitely let me know down below in the comments. So really, those are some of the main features of this build. But really, the biggest feature of the EZDMG-103 kit is the fact that it makes the whole DMG-103 mod, well, easier. Which actually brings us to the pros and cons. Starting with the pros, like I've stated many times in the video, this kit definitely does make the build easier to do, despite still being quite difficult. But more importantly, it results in a much more refined end product. Compared to legacy DMG-103 builds, this particular version is easy to take apart and quite serviceable if repair work is needed. The same really can't be said of the methods used in the past. I mean, imagine trying to fix something in a build like this. Additionally, I think Andre really nailed some of the design aspects of this version of the 103, in particular with regard to the triggers he used, and their position on the back. It's really comfortable to hold, and your index fingers have a natural feeling resting position on the 360 triggers themselves. Now, when it comes to the DMG-103 mod in general, I think I'd rather opt to do a DS macro build. It has all the same functionality as a DMG-103, but it's easier to do, and in my opinion, it has a much sleeker appearance. However, for those that love the DMG form factor and want to play Game Boy Advance games in that format, well, the EZDMG kit is really the only option I would use to achieve that goal. And lastly, I think it's well priced at $55 for the kit. It's pretty affordable. However, do keep in mind that this does not account for all the other components you will need to source to do this project. So while the DMG-103 form factor isn't my absolute favorite, I do have to say that Andre nailed the mod kit for it. It's honestly the only way I would ever want to perform the DMG-103 mod, hands down. Anyway, now let's get into the cons. And as if I haven't said this multiple times already, even though Andre's kit does make the DMG-103 mod easier and more streamlined, it is still a very difficult mod. Removing all the components on the DS motherboard is really quite challenging work, but much of the work after that isn't all that bad thanks to Andre's kit. So if you're dead set on building a 103, then this is by far and away the best way to accomplish that. Now, while I praise the triggers for being very comfortable to use, they do protrude quite a bit from the shell, making the portability aspect of the EZDMG-103 less than ideal. I actually do believe Andre did design an alternate shell that utilizes flatter triggers that protrude a lot less, so if these larger triggers are an issue for you, I would recommend looking into that. Other than that, this is the absolute best way to make a DMG-103 build. It's extremely well thought out, and overall a very good build experience. So if you're in the market for a 103, this would be my choice in pursuing this kind of mod. Well folks, there you have it. The EZDMG-103 mod for the Nintendo DS. While not my favorite way to play Game Boy Advance games, I really do love the creativity and dedication of modders to making some of the most wild builds out there, as well as the effort by modders like Andre to make these mods easier and cleaner to perform. Now if you enjoyed this video, I really think you'll like this one here, so check it out. And as always, thank you all so much for tuning in today, and I'll catch you again next time.